Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Conservative Energy Network. Our mission is to champion secure, reliable, affordable, clean American energy. We operate in 26 states with staff on the ground to educate decision makers and the general public on energy issues. And remember, education is not a one-way street. We also have to listen so we can identify and understand what's important to the public. And a critical part of that is understanding where the public stands on energy issues, what motivates them, what concerns them, and how we can best communicate the value of conservative energy solutions to the public. CEN's been working with Cygnal, one of the nation's premier public opinion and research firms, on a poll that was conducted in the Ohio and Pennsylvania portions of PJM, and in the southern portion of MISO, specifically in the states of Arkansas, Missouri, and Mississippi, to see what voters think about the affordability and reliability of electricity and their thoughts on the electric grid and grid modernization. Cygnal is an award-winning international public opinion and predictive analysis firm. Nationally recognized as a premier pollster, Cygnal boasts an impressive 94% accuracy rate in the 2024 election cycle. With experience in all 50 states and 17 countries, the firm has conducted over 3,000 campaigns and more than 1,500 polls since 2003. With me today is Chris Lane, a senior partner at Cygnal, and he'll break down the findings and offer analysis on voter sentiment around the key issues and also share fresh insights into how voters are thinking about energy policy, from transmission reliability to cost, permitting, and the environment, and what that means for making the case for market-driven conservative solutions. I'm going to hand it over to Chris now. If you have any questions as we go through the poll, hit the Q&A button, put them in there, and at the end, we'll try and answer as many of your questions as we can. Chris?
Well, first and foremost, John, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for having me today. As John mentioned, my name is Chris Lane. I'm from Cygnal. We are the #1 ranked most accurate polling firm in the country by 538 the last 4 cycles running. It's been an honor to work with CEN on these projects and really get a real snapshot of people's sentiment on a whole host of issues, all of which we'll go over today. While I tend to prefer to be in person with everyone and have a human connection, what I really like about doing these Zoom calls is we get to dive in deeper into the data and really look at crosstabs in a way that isn't really feasible in a big auditorium. So with that, I'm going to hop into this. Excited to have your questions and move through this at a pace that keeps everybody engaged and not sick of my voice by the end of it. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and excited to get going here. So as John mentioned, this is 2 different regional polls, and we're going to take a look at both in different ways, and then specifically at one or the other in a few instances. We did 2 different regions here, one being Arkansas, Missouri, and then the PJM region, Pennsylvania and Ohio. So first off, we need to talk about who are we talking to here? And any poll that is worth their salt needs to be truly representative of the areas that we're talking about here. So these 2 polls, Pennsylvania and Ohio, and Arkansas, Missouri, and Mississippi, we need to make sure that ideologically they actually represent the states, and then combined regionally, they actually represent it in a perfect manner. So this is just more for context. So in Pennsylvania and Ohio, we would call this a R+3 environment, where we have Republicans at 46%, Democrats at 43%. And then in the other region, Arkansas, Missouri, and Mississippi, 54-33, this is an R+21. So if an election was held today and you throw out the candidates' names and you throw out the spends and you throw everything away, as simple as R versus D, one region would be R+21, the other would be R+3, and our poll has to be that in order to be truly representative across the board. So we started very simply. How concerned are you about the affordability of your utility bills and rising energy costs? And overwhelmingly, 87 and 89% respectively are concerned about this issue. I've been tracking energy issues for the better part of a decade now. Cost as always pops really well, but never as high as I see in this poll. We're talking 8-to-1 of people who are concerned versus not concerned about their energy costs. And particularly in an environment of inflation over the last half decade, people are getting more and more concerned. and an opportunity for those who work in this space to capitalize on the attention and enthusiasm on this issue. Just to take a little bit closer look, this is the PJM poll. And I wanted to show you here, this is not a right issue. This is not a left issue. This is not a young versus old. This is not college educated versus non-college educated. If you take a look at this dark blue, it is unbelievably consistent across the board who's worried about this issue. And if we really focus in here, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, 86, 87, and 87% respectively. I would be really, really hard pressed to come up with a handful of questions in which Republicans, Democrats, and Independents look almost identical. And that is true across the age spectrum, the gender spectrum, and who they voted for in this past election. So then we moved on to which energy policies are most important to you. And we allowed people to select up to two options. So in polling, we really like to make people make hard choices because if everything's important, nothing's important. And so when forced to do that and we asked people to select their top two, we had two that really separated from the pack and tremendous consistency across both regions. That's the other thing I'd encourage you to keep in mind throughout this whole presentation is, oftentimes different parts of the country feel really differently about different issues. And these two regions have some things in common, but a whole lot less, a whole lot more that's not in common. And the tremendous consistency we see in some of these answers, if not the vast majority of them. So, keeping electricity costs affordable for families. 2/3 of both groups had this as their top two issue. From there, ensuring that it's safe and reliable, and then everything else sort of lagging behind, but a clear top two. And I want you to really note this cost portion because we see this throughout this poll and is really part of my major takeaways from a strategic standpoint for CEN and similar groups who are fighting these battles across the country. So then we asked, do you support or oppose making investments in America's electricity transmission grid to improve reliability, reduce costs, unlock economic growth? All the fights that you folks are fighting on a daily basis. And there is overwhelming support here. So 78% and 75% respectively support. And there's such little opposition that my graphics department couldn't put the number in the oppose orange because it's simply not big enough. But the point here is it's about 3% here and about 4% here. So overwhelmingly, near 20-to-1 ratios, people support the idea of making this investment. And I will tell you, anytime you talk about any sort of investment by the American people, by the government, there's a good portion of the population who always hears tax increase and how it's going to affect my pocketbook. And it always, always drives down support and drives up opposition. That does not happen here. And that to me is the real takeaway. Once again, we just looking at PJM as an example here. Again, 78-3. Look at the consistency across the board. There is no outlier. There is no partisan split. There is no demographic split. It is uniform agreement across the board. The other thing I'd point out to you really quickly on this and then slides moving forward is the difference between this dark blue and light blue. The dark blue represents strongly support, whereas the light blue is somewhat support. And look at that split. It's about 2/3 strong and 1/3 somewhat. And so on every question, I'm always looking at the intensity behind something. Because if something is lukewarm or lukecold, that means it can be moved really easily, particularly with political advertising and messaging. This is a hard number. This is a strong number. The best example I give is Donald Trump has the hardest numbers you can have. From his favorable to his unfavorable, there's very few people who are somewhat on him one way or the other. And that's a good indicator of how strong the support is here. And we'll see differences throughout the rest of the presentation. Which of the following comes closest to your view of our electricity transmission grid? And we see a sort of a pyramid effect here, but the most common answer, the plurality answer, is the grid is aging and requires significant modernization expansion to meet future demands. And we see that in both regions once again. I will also tell you, and this is what I told the CEN team as we worked through putting together this poll, one of my big fears was the complexity of this issue. And do people understand? And are people engaged on this issue? And is there enough education going on where they recognize some of these things that need to happen and what's their perception of what needs to happen. So I think this is a really good news that people almost a majority both feel that there is improvements that need to be made. And we'll talk a little bit more about if they're willing to make them in a second. How concerned are you about the reliability of the electricity transmission grid? For example, the risk of blackouts and power outages. And we see once again, 2 to 1, people are concerned about the reliability. So typically, on a whole bunch of issues, people are not terribly concerned about things until something goes wrong, and then it gets all the time and attention it deserves. But to have this foresight that they are concerned before major problems is again a great opportunity for where things stand, and that public sentiment is on the side of innovation. Once again, I just wanted to point out how consistent this is across the crosstabs and heat maps. But I did want to point this out. We just talked about that hard number versus soft number. And we see here, this is a much softer number. Almost 2/3 of this is somewhat concerned. And again, to the point of sometimes you need big things to happen to get support or attention. But check out how soft this is on both sides, and just a major difference from what we saw in the previous question. National grid upgrade. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Upgrading our electricity transmission grid is important for national security. Once again, we have 7 to 1, 6.5 to 1 in Arkansas, Missouri, and Mississippi of this ratio of people who agree that this is important to national security. So now, what's great about this issue from a political perspective for me is it's really hard to motivate the whole political spectrum on a whole host of issues. But now, if you come at it from a bunch of different angles, from saving the planet, from a reliability standpoint, from a national security standpoint, from a cost standpoint, you're able to start really bringing people together under one's tent, which is why we see such consistency across the board here. So we asked people that initial question, and then we wanted to test some messaging. And people who have heard me talk before have heard me ad nauseum talk about the difference between what's popular and what's effective. And yes, what we want every campaign we're a part of to what we're saying to be popular. Why would we want to say things that are unpopular? But for me, what's actually more important is what's effective. What moves people from one place to the other? Because otherwise, you're just lighting money on fire and throwing it up in the air. So from this, we're measuring those two ideas. And one was about positive impact for Americans, American energy, lower cost, and preventing blackouts. And you can see the context, that the full sentences that people actually saw here. And then we checked out the popularity first. So I would encourage you to look at this dark blue more than anything. So together, this is what people more likely to support this idea. But this dark blue is much more likely. 33, 35, 32, 41%. So we see a little bit more for that preventing blackouts, but fairly consistent across the board. What I typically tell clients, and this is usually in a head-to-head political campaign, not always, but I'm always looking for at least 30 or 35% in this dark blue as a message that's worth putting money behind. And the really good news, and from all the hard work that CN has done previously on this, and all the groups supporting them, is that they had a good idea of what was going to work. And we see that here with 4 strong messages that are worth investing in. So I just want to take 5 seconds to explain what this is. This is called a message map. And as I just talked about, we want what we say to be popular, but I'm more interested in what's effective. And so on the y-axis here, we are measuring that popularity. The higher it up it is, the more popular it is. But on the x-axis, we're measuring the effectiveness. What actually brought people from one place to another? So typically, I really want to see things closer to the right side of the screen than higher up on the screen. And almost always, things that are really popular tend not to be quite as effective, and things that are a little bit polarizing tend to be more effective because it evokes an emotional reaction out of people. And so that's the delicate game of give and take that we have to play here. So we just looked at PJM on this message maps, and it was very similar. for the other region as well. But if we take a look at what moved conservatives, well, lower costs overwhelmingly moved conservatives versus the preventing blackouts and the positive impact for Americans messages. I just want to point out one thing here that's really, really important to me. If we remember that preventing blackouts message had the most intensity behind it, it was the most popular one. But look where it is on this effectiveness scale. It moved virtually no conservatives. And so when we're targeting conservatives and we're talking to them about these issues, we're not moving anybody on these two messages, despite the fact that they're two most popular. So if we look at this scale, let's call this a zero point 0.1 for math's sake, and let's call this a 1.2. So our dollar goes 12 times further talking about lower costs than these other two messages. That's all well and good for conservatives, but what about everybody else? These are self-described moderates. How do we move them? Positive impact for Americans and lower costs. Once again, that blackouts message that was so popular, sort of lagging behind. So if we had exclusively made our decisions based off what was popular, we wouldn't be moving very many folks in the process. Then we wanted to take a look at liberals, self-described liberals, and what moved them. And once again, this American energy message, the most effective of moving the portion of liberals that could move. And if you notice, it's again, once again, the lowest on the popularity scale. Whereas this lower cost message, which we felt so strongly about with conservatives in particular and with moderates, completely falls off the map. Then we wanted to focus a little bit about, who's responsible for this decision making. As you guys know far better than I, there's a lot of hoops to jump through on this. Local partners, federal partners, landowners, companies, the federal government, everything that has to go into this. So we need to be armed with ammo and information about how people actually feel, rather than the loud noises on both sides. If a new high voltage electricity line was proposed in the area, would you just generally support it or oppose it? And again, we ask in your area, where you are. So I can give you an example. Nuclear energy, for example, pulls off the charts. But when you start talking about in their backyard, it changes dramatically. And that's why I think it's really important that we talked about in your area here. And once again, 56 to 16, 59 to 13 support high voltage electricity lines in their area. And then what would be the most important reason for you to building these new power lines? And a consistent theme, lowering electricity bills and improving reliability. Time and time and time again, we see cost trumping everything else. What would be your biggest concern about living near this area? And again, a very clear plurality being about health or safety risks. So if you were to start a campaign tomorrow, or you were doing messages and political advertising, not only do we want to talk about our messages, you want to take the bullets out of the gun of your opponent. And so by addressing these things out front, they're not going to be as effective as moving people when you ease those concerns. And I think that's the main takeaway from this slide. Do you support or oppose building more transmission lines, including across state borders, to connect energy sources and strengthen reliability? Broken record, huge and overwhelming support, 8-1 in both regions. And then who should pay for these? Well, we see a difference a little bit between who's paying for things and who's responsible for decision making. So we see pretty closely even between each state, the federal government, and a little bit from private companies here. This was frankly the most surprising question for me in this whole survey. Would you be willing to pay a few extra dollars a month on your electricity bill in the short term if it helped upgrade the grid, reduce outages, and lower electricity costs in the long term? And it's typically difficult for people to see beyond the immediacy. And the fact that you have almost 2-1 support that folks are willing to do this surprised me, considering the areas we're polling here. Think about Arkansas, Missouri, and Mississippi, that R plus 21 environment. Hugely, hugely Republican area, says they're willing to do it. And that is not consistent with what I typically see on these types of things, not necessarily energy, but investments for the long term in areas like this. Willingness to pay more. So as you go into Senate president's offices and speakers' offices and governors' offices and you have these discussions, I think some natural feedback you would get is, well, my base wouldn't want this. My Republican, this makes me vulnerable in a Republican primary, stuff like that, which I deal with a lot. But the fact of the matter is, Republicans are actually 17 points above water that they are willing to do this. Now, once again, check out the softness of this number. So that is how vulnerable this could be if one group or another spent a lot of time and money investing. You have just 36% combined in those dark areas with a whole bunch of uncertainty. So I want to make sure that we really focus on how easily a battle like this could be won or lost when the numbers are this soft. Interstate authority. Who should have the primary say in approving new interstate? So while we saw people wanted the federal government to pay, they don't want them to have the authority. And overwhelmingly, the people that do are left-leaning Harris voters, Democrats. Uh, the plurality, particularly in our southern region here, want local communities and landowners, and then supplemented by state government to some degree as well. Landowners' refusal. Should landowners be allowed to block construction of transmission lines on their property, or should um, can it be built over landowner objections if fair compensation is provided? We start to see a real competitive edge here. It's relatively close, a slight majority in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and almost a majority in Arkansas and Missouri says that landowners have the right to refuse this. But about 35, 36% respectively thinks that they should be able to proceed for the greater good with fair compensation. In your opinion, should landowners, local officials, state officials, or the federal government choose how electricity is produced? Once again, in this area, we see landowners, local, state, far more than federal, just as a piece of ammo as you navigate these issues. Should private companies, not utilities, be allowed to compete in building power lines to speed up upgrades? Um, uh, Basically, should we be able to expedite this process with good competition? And once again, we're almost 3-1 here in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Uh, and we're over 3-1, approaching 4-1 in Arkansas, Missouri, and Mississippi. Once again, overwhelming support. A closer look at PJM, when we talk about private companies being allowed to get involved, we see 65-23. But this is where we start to see the partisan split on an issue like this. Republicans 79-13. Really hard to get much more than that on, frankly, anything. Democrats 48-38. So it's not that Democrats are actually on the other side of this, but we do see a huge difference. So instead of plus 66 here, we see plus 10 for Democrats. So 56-point swing between those two things. And then once again, on a similar line, do you support or oppose streamlining regulations to speed up this process? Near 2-1, but I would note we fall under 50% here, and it becomes a little more confusing, a little more complicated for folks. And then again, more importantly, in the crosstabs, this is where Democrats are near evenly split, and Republicans are overwhelmingly supportive at 64-13. And we see that same dynamic between Trump 2024 voters and Harris 2024 voters. I included the slide because, frankly, we all work in this, you know, very competitive space of reaching people and where are people getting their news. So I just wanted to spend 5 seconds on this of where people are digesting their information. National broadcast television, local broadcast television, and cable news. And we let people select up to 3 options. So I show this for a couple reasons. One, a lot of campaigns I deal with now are talk to me a lot about, is TV a waste of money? Is it worth it? This is what I tend to show them. Yes, it's expensive, but there's a reason it's expensive. It's because you're reaching a whole audience that frankly isn't on these other things. I have Republican primary candidates talk to me about TikTok and I say, congratulations, you've reached the 7 voters who are on TikTok in your Republican primary. I say that a little bit in jest, and there absolutely is overwhelming data that Gen Z voters, 18 to 27, approximately, 77% of them call TikTok one of their primary news sources. But as we're talking about an electorate, let's just make sure that we're clear on who is actually getting their information from what source. And then finally, just the demographics of this poll. I mentioned earlier, uh, a polling firm is based off of how well they represent the electorate. My biggest frustration at times is um, what a lot of people do is if you had 1,000 sample like we did on this survey, they collect 1,000 responses, they weight it to what the demographics are supposed to look like, and then they call it representative. Um, when we do 1,000 sample poll, we're probably really collecting 15, 16, 17, 1,800 responses because the odds that we got the exact right 1,000 people with perfect demographic splits on sex, age, household income, education, geography, partisanship, ideology in our first 1,000 out of 1,000 is zero. And anyone doing that also has the odds of zero. So this is the perfect representation of how these 3 states combined need to be represented in a survey. So from a voting population standpoint, Missouri has 56% of this poll because it represents 56% of the population in these 3 states. Um, and then we did the exact same thing with Pennsylvania and Ohio. So with that, John, I'm going to kick it back to you. I'd love to answer questions. I hope that gives people a good jumping off point for today. And thanks again for the opportunity to be with you.
Well, Chris, that was awesome. This is the second time I've seen this, and I pick something up new every time. We do have a number of questions here, so let me start with the um, top one. I think you kind of answered this, but let's just give it a go. Do voters prefer the clean energy transmission projects be decided more at the state level, or do they trust the federal approach?
Yeah, in these regions, overwhelmingly, it's definitely better on the local side. Uh, it was about 45-50% from local government and local stakeholders and landowners, and then a little bit more supportive on that state level. And then we see a huge drop off on the federal side of things. Um, Particularly in Republican dominated areas, that's precisely what you would see on almost every single issue, this one included. But Pennsylvania and Ohio is no bastion of conservatism. I know President Trump did really well there last time, but people forget that Joe Biden won all of those swing states just 4 years ago. So we have, and that's why we see an R+3 advantage here. It's very close, um, but that is the trend we see on almost every issue on like this.
Okay. This is a good question. This is more of a little technical one. Were terms like American energy further defined for participants, or are they only given the information you show here? And they go on and say, I wonder if there's a divide for Republicans where American energy could mean more natural gas, whereas for Democrats it might mean renewables like solar and wind. I think that's a great question.
Yeah, let me start with the first half of that question first about the technical nature of it.
Uh,
We talked a lot about that internally about whether people would understand
uh,
what an electrician, I'm sorry, what a transmission grid even is. So we did provide a definition of what that is as a part of just merely informing what we're talking about here. We tried to do it in a way that was not leading in one direction or the other and made sure that it was strictly informing people what we're talking about. To the specific example given, I don't think we defined it in that sense. But from the other work that I've done in the energy space, I can tell you unequivocally, the support for energy is off the charts. And then how is so unbelievably divided. I mentioned nuclear earlier, huge divides from a partisanship standpoint there, even bigger divides, frankly, on a gender split on nuclear energy. And then, oh, absolutely, there's definitely buckets that really fall to conservatives, and there's buckets that fall for more liberals and progressives. So as we navigate all of these issues, we do have to keep that in mind that there is a partisan split there.
okay. Going to the 4 messages that we had, There's a question here that said the four messages had very limited effectiveness among liberal voters. Is that partly due to no arguments regarding the environment or climate change? And I'm going to combine that with another one here, which was how can advocates best communicate the benefits of transmission investment in ways that resonate with the concerns voters expressed in the polling? And I combine them because I think they go together. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so we tested those four messages. I wish we had 45 messages to test because to be able to see where those things fall in comparison to one another in particular, for me is where the tremendous value is. And yes, I don't think our messages were particularly partisan. And I think we saw in a whole bunch of questions that the support between Democrats and Republicans was actually quite aligned. But that is a good takeaway from this survey that the messages that we had, that we talked about, did have a much bigger impact on conservatives and liberals. So the next time we do this, or as we explore this more, we have to be conscious of that, and we have to listen to what the data is telling us. And I think that's a tremendous piece of feedback from whoever submitted that.
And then how can advocates best communicate the benefits of transmission investment in ways that resonate with the concerns voters expressed in the polling? I'll, I'll answer that a little bit myself. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what we do with our Land and Liberty Coalition down at the grass tops and the grassroots level, where we go out and we talk to individuals, we talk to decision makers, and in the best way we know how, communicate that to them. Now, that's what I say. Now, what do you say based on one of the last slides where you show where people get their information? Is one way better than another? Because I don't think, well, I know our organization can't uh, spend a lot of money on broadcast TV. So, what are the best ways that you think, based on where people get their information? You got any insights on that?
Yeah. So to answer your second question first, what I would do if John calls me tomorrow and say, "Hey, Chris, we're going to invest $1 million into these messages. What would you do?" What I would do is I would go create a message map, not for liberals, not conservatives, not for moderates, but the people who moved the most. And I would say, okay, who moved the most? What made them move the most? And then go into deeper into the crosstabs. What media outlets do they consume the most? So that way we're getting more and more and more efficient with our dollars. That way we're going into that world. And sometimes I get pushback from candidates in particular that well, it's disingenuous to say one message to one group and one message to another. And I understand the natural pushback of that, but the fact of the matter is you're not saying things in contrast to each other.
Mhm.
You're trying to appeal to 100% of the vote. So I think it's political malpractice not to see what moves each group the most and make sure that we're talking about that thing with that group. And frankly, if you talk about unity and bringing people together around ideas, why wouldn't you do that? That's how I would do the second part. John, I apologize. I don't remember part one of the question anymore.
I was scrolling here looking for the next question.
We'll
Um, that's all right. We'll take the next
move
question
on.
because it already fell off my screen. Um, Here's an interesting one. Uh, are folks asked to indicate their level of familiarity with these types of issues, conversations at the beginning of the poll, and they're trying to get at an understanding of how confident folks are with an opinion on this. And I think that's a good kind of technical question. What say you?
It's a great question. And I would be curious if we added that as like almost a demographic question moving forward to be able to compare those folks. But what I would say from a general election voter sentiment standpoint is I want that exact mix of people highly educated on the issue and not highly educated on the issue, because that's representative of where the public is. So if we're only talking to people who are super engaged on this issue, they're going to have a really different set of answers than the people who have no engagement on this. And that's what I preach about effective sample size and representative of the of who
Mhm.
we're talking to. For example, if someone was highly educated on an issue, what you would say to them would change, and and frankly, you wouldn't have to spend time and energy educating them on it because they would already be there.
True.
So that would be my pushback to that question. While I'd be interested in the crosstabs of comparing to those folks, The idea of just having that one group or the other, I think, does us a disservice as we figure out how to talk about this at a macro level.
And that's a good point. If everyone was highly educated, you wouldn't need CEN, probably wouldn't need polling, wouldn't need a lot of the organizations that we work with to educate people on the importance of these things.
We'd be out of a
Uh,
job, John.
could be. Uh, Politicians wouldn't have a job either, I guess. This is a question kind of in the same vein. Do you think that the big questions about who should be making the big decisions would change if people had a basic understanding how those decisions are already made? Could they be choosing state government because they already think that state government is in charge of transmission development?
I would say that generally speaking, people have a greater trust, respect, and relationship to the offices that are closest to them. So that is their natural inclination. I can tell you, we've done polling, we've done modeling and analytics work on who you trust the most, your state rep,
Mhm.
your state senator, your governor, your president, so on and so forth. And if you throw out the really partisan folks who are affected by who those people actually are, people have such stronger relationships with their state representative than anybody. And even state rep to state senator, in most states, that's usually about 3 or 4x the district. The name ID of a state rep is typically, I'm really going broad strokes here. It's typically about 45%, whereas a state senator is usually about 27%. So huge differences, despite the fact that you know they're relatively in the same ballpark.
That's an interesting stat. I wish I'd have known that when I was still elected. Um, I think that could vary state to state too, because the size of the districts that you cover, like for example, North Carolina, my district was 90,000 people. I've talked to people in Rhode Island, Vermont, where they have like 4,000 people. I mean, that's like your neighbors, everybody knows you. So,
Absolutely. And every state does make a huge difference, but generally you do see that sort of gap. The number one way I make legislators mad at me is when I hand them their name ID, and it's usually about half of what they think it is. But I encourage them to think about it this way. If you went to the grocery store and 100 people were there, how many people would know who you are? If you and so when you have 40 out of 100 people know who you are in your grocery store, that's really good.
that is good.
But when you see 40% name ID, all they see is 60% who have no idea who they are.
People move everything. All right, I'll get off the politics side. That's a good question here. Um, what do I do? Any glimpses of if or how data centers are playing into this issue in any way? Is it helpful or unhelpful to say that transmission is needed to help out to help our economic competitiveness and get data centers and AI online?
Yeah, that question might be above my pay grade and not really a focus of what we talked about here today. But there is absolutely no doubt what information people are digesting and how they're digesting it has an enormous impact. Particularly from an ideological standpoint. And I think the biggest problem with your data sources at this point is the algorithms are unbelievably good in the sense of they just continue to feed you um, affirming statistics for whatever you already believe. And I think that's part of the echo chamber that we tend to live in right now. So I think breaking through those echo chambers
Mhm.
and frankly meeting people where they are is where I try to advise organizations, candidates, et cetera, to make sure that we're breaking through that noise and not just talking to people who already agree with us.
Okay, now here's a good question, and I think it refers to your message, Matt, because the person asked, can you explain again about how you measured effectiveness versus popularity? What opinion are folks being moved on in order to show effectiveness?
Absolutely. So what we do is we ask what an initial ballot. So in this case, it was one of those questions. Then we feed them the four messages and then an informed ballot. And through regressional analysis, we're able to determine how they responded to each of those questions and what was the one that actually got them to move. So it's a complicated formula, but that's how we're able to measure the difference between those two things. And just as an added anecdote, um, when you ask people what moves them, they do a really poor job of accurately identifying things. The best example I can give is negative political ads. Everyone will tell you how much they hate negative political ads, but if I gave you 10 ads and we did a message map on them, and five were positive and five were negative, I would be shocked if the top three were not the top three negative ads. I've seen it happen time and time and time again, and that's why you continue to see them more and more. Because despite the fact that people tell you they don't like them, they are overwhelmingly more effective than positive ads.
Okay. Uh, there was a follow-up from the same question. It's like, who is considered persuadable when support starts out at up to the 70s and 80s for transmission investment overall? And there's really kind of a follow-on to that I'd like to ask too. It's a good question. Who's persuadable, and is the juice worth the squeeze on trying to get from 80% to 84%?
Yeah, John, something we talked about in Cleveland a few weeks ago is, and generally, there is a segment of the population in this particular situation. It tends to be hyper progressive, hyper liberal voters that, frankly, I think are ungettable. And I think that's true in every election on every issue. So, frankly, catering to the base or catering to people who are never, ever, ever, ever going to vote for you or vote in the way that you hope that they do is just wasting money. So what we typically do and what we did in this instance is we do something called segmentation analysis. And we're able to determine the hard block of people who are going to be with you no matter what, the hard block of people who are going to be against you no matter what, and take a look at who that persuadable audience actually is. In this scenario, they tended to be self-identified moderates. They tended to be a little less political. They tended to be, center left, center right folks, and they tended to be a little bit more parent aged than anybody else. So that I'm happy to send a little bit more to John to disperse the group of what that segmentation analysis looked like. But generally speaking, that is who the persuadables on this issue was.
Okay. And you highlighted a few slides when you went by where you said, well, this is where you see Democrats start to break from Republicans on these issues.
Hmm.
And the question was, any surprising partisan differences in how voters view transmission expansion or grid modernization? So you didn't mention it, but if you wouldn't mind going back again to the one or two things that struck you the most on that and the partisan differences.
The number one thing that struck me from this poll, from a surprising standpoint, was Republicans' willingness to recognize the problem and invest in it. That to me is the number one takeaway. Democrats are almost always willing to invest in public infrastructure in some capacity. And then secondly, how closely aligned Republicans and Democrats were on the vast majority of these, very rare to see, and something that absolutely needs to be capitalized on. But if you're asking me my overarching biggest takeaway from the survey,
Yep.
besides those things, is to make sure that we're really focused on cost when we're having these conversations. Voters demonstrated time and time again that that's what they care about the most. And John, just to reiterate our conversation in Cleveland again, um, what typically moves people on message maps and what typically moves people in elections is the most emotional issue you can possibly find. And how does this affect me? And while we talk about these things and everyone wants to give, a articulate answer, at the end of the day, it's really more selfish than that. And so when we talk about these things, we have to make sure there's an emotional component, a human component, and we're talking about those things in the right way. And cost separates itself from the pack with a whole bunch of different group of voters on a whole bunch of different topics. So I would say those are my two or three that I make sure that people walk away with on this.
That's good. And it's not my saying, but I always quoted that all politics are local.
Hmm.
And the only question you have to answer when you're knocking on a door, the question in the voter's mind is, if I vote for you, what are you going to do for me? Which is a much simpler way for my simple uh, elected mind, a former elected mind, to put it.
I think that's perfectly well put. And I see organizations and ballot questions and candidates too often trying to win the argument intellectually and not meeting voters where they are. And I commend them for it. But just as another quick example, on those message maps, almost always the least effective thing possible is a candidate's bio, organization's bio,
Right.
because there's nothing there that's about them. And yes, you need to introduce yourself to the world, whether you're CEN or John for Congress. Uh, but it has to be about the voter. It has to be about the end user experience. And I see too many people fall into that trap where they make it about them as if they're applying for a job, which of course is what democracy is, but it's not what campaigning is.
Absolutely right. All right, moving on to another question here. This is an interesting question, really. Do people understand or even know about the role of RTOs?
Yeah, we didn't test that. My gut is overwhelmingly no. But that's the other great thing about polling, to be honest, is we are infinitely better prepared to conduct our next poll knowing what we know now. And that's a good thing that for us to potentially dive our teeth into next time around because my gut would be no.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you on that. From my experience in the legislature, I would tell you that if you asked 100 legislators what an RTO actually did, they may or may not be able to answer the question. Energy is one of those things where it's very, very technical. And once you get to that level of technical information, the average voter, their eyes just kind of glaze over and they don't even. I'm not sure we tested this either, but somebody asked, what clean energy benefits resonate most with voters? Lower costs, energy independence, or reduced environmental impact?
Yeah, without testing it, I don't want to speak to it. And
Uh,
I will tell you that generally, and I think this is intuitive, and you don't need me to say this, a cost issue does much better with center right to the right, and environmental stuff does better with the left to center left. But frankly, that's why we test things, because it's not just an instinct or a guess, it's intelligence for action. And that's why I'm on a whole bunch of these. My guesses probably would not have been quite where a few of these ended
mhm.
up, and a whole bunch of them, it was precisely where I thought it ended up. So, yeah, I don't want to speak hypothetically, but generally, that's what I see on energy issues.
And I think that's generally what we see in the field as well, which, to your point earlier, you have to meet people where they are. You can educate someone, but first you have to listen to them and figure out what they know, what they don't know, and figure out if you're one-on-one or one in a room, figure out what they want to know. Because just because I want to tell them something doesn't mean that that's what they want to know. So, all right, what do I got here? How helpful could a one-year follow-up on this poll after the PGM rate increase takes effect again after last year's increase?
John,
Uh,
I've been meaning to talk to you. I'm really hoping we do this
all
poll.
right. Oh, okay.
In all seriousness, for me, benchmark polls are awesome because you figure out where you are. But without doing follow-ups 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, whatever it is on particular issues, you're sort of just you're not taking advantage of your investment of doing the poll initially. Because if you're not tracking where it's going and what's working or not working, what was the point of finding out where it was to begin
Right.
with? So, in a genuine sense, yes, and I would encourage anyone who's working on any number of issues when you make a decision to poll, make sure you're doing it more than once. And if you're not going to do it more than once, don't do it at all and spend your money doing other things with it, uh, because you're not squeezing all the juice out of it that you should be.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And that's why we chose to do this particular poll at this particular time with a definite change in federal policy that we still don't know all the changes coming down the road with that, that it was good. And we kind of looked at this as a benchmark so that when we go forward, we can see where people are right now. And as much as federal policy in some areas of energy seems to be moving, we might have to do this again down the road sooner rather than later. Um, okay, if I'm a legislator or legislative aide watching this, what is the biggest takeaway for me? How bold can we go with transmission policy?
Yeah, I think I answered that first part already,
Yeah,
but I think the boldness thing is a really good question because if you're a legislator, if you're a legislative aide, and you only have so much political capital, there's only so much that you can put yourself behind. I think the really good news here is that you see the overwhelming support across the political spectrum. And so, if you're in a very DC or in a very RC or a very swing district, the door's open. And you can get behind these things, and you have a whole bunch of data here that you can cite on this. I think where you start to see the answers come a little bit closer together, 50 to 40, you just have to be conscious of that, and you have to be aware of the dynamics that are at play, and how far you want to push this. But from an overall sentiment standpoint, these results were about as positive as I could have imagined them being. So I would encourage everyone to utilize this opportunity because, as we know, the political spectrum and culture changes really quickly. depending on what's going on in the world. And I think this is sort of a strike while the iron's hot moment for energy.
I'd like to add a little about this too, about
Please.
how bold can we go with transmission policy? I think it goes back to the two biggest takeaways, which is costs, i.e. affordability and reliability. You were what, 88 some percent, above 88% on those. Do you want affordable electricity? Do you want a reliable grid? I think you can be as bold as you want to on those. Maybe some of the other things where on your message maps, depending on what the district looks like, you might be a little less, uh, or you might be a little more careful about heading off into some of those other things. I mean, would you agree with my analysis on that?
I would. The only thing I'd point out is not only was it people who wouldn't support affordable energy. Like that type of question would be of course. But the question we asked was how concerned are you about it? And that is where you had 80-90% of people
Hmm.
legitimately concerned. And so that, and a very hard number on top of it, of very concerned. So I think that's the real thing here is that not only is this something that are we talking about, but it's something that people are aware of and something that they're telling us causes them concern in their life. And to me, that's the exact magic formula to move things across the finish line.
We're running a little short on time. If I've got one or two more questions in the queue here, so if anybody has another burning issue they'd like to ask Chris, put it in there. But this is a good question. It's a little bit long. So it says the majority of respondents said that local communities and landowners should have primary say in approving new interstate transmission line routes. Yet, protecting the right of local communities and landowners when building energy projects was the fifth most popular answer for what energy policy goals are most important to you. There's a contradiction there. Well, why do you think that contradiction exists?
So I don't see it as a contradiction. What I see it is when people are forced to make hard choices between things, what rises and what falls. Because I could tell you 10 things that we absolutely both agree upon, John, that we think are important in our life. But when I force you to pick two and force me to pick two, there's a good chance that those things won't overlap. So that doesn't mean it's no longer important to me, but life is about making decisions about what priorities there are. And that's what how voters feel. And so that's where I don't see it as a contradiction, but I see it as when forced to make hard choices where people fall, which is why we make them do it. Because you're not going to start a campaign tomorrow with 10, 12, 15 different talking points. People can't digest that. You're going to
Right.
test them all, you're going to pick the best two or three, and you're going to run with that in order to be successful of actually moving the ball.
Yeah. This isn't really a question, it's a comment here. Alice Madden says, as a former state rep, she's referring to when you were talking about in the grocery store. She says she totally believes it because she was stopped in the grocery store. And Alice, when I was elected, I was stopped in the grocery store several times too.
I
And
worked for Governor Charlie Baker, who's over my shoulder
uh,
right now in Massachusetts for 8 years, and he would often tell people much easier to be governor than a local official because they can't stop you on the soccer field on Saturday mornings. And the reason he ran for selectman was because he was too scared to run for school committee. So that I think speaks to what you're talking about, and that's where the accountability at the local level is higher than it is anywhere else.
it is. And that's what makes the work that CEN does so important because we work in the state capitals with legislators, and we also work down at the county level talking to decision makers and people who are interested in energy, need to be educated about it so that we can get siting fixed, if you will, and combat some of the misconceptions and frankly, some of the myths about energy of all forms, be it solar, wind, nuke, gas, coal. People think things because most of the time they're not focused on energy unless their lights don't turn on, focused on paying the mortgage, buying a new car, making sure the kids are doing the homework, things like that, which I don't say that in a bad way. It's just a matter of fact. So we're at the end of our time, and we really appreciate you spending your time with us and explaining the results of this poll. Any last minute pearls of wisdom for us to take away from this, Chris?
Yeah, I want to thank everyone who joined today, and I want to thank CEN for being such a incredible partner on this and doing research that frankly no one else is doing and how beneficial it could be to a whole bunch of folks. I just want to comment one more time on what you just said, and it circles back to a question that someone asked about how educated are people on this issue? And I think one of the biggest frustrations about government and campaigns and running is if everyone was armed with all the information, then it would be a very easy world. But the idea is the perception of these things is what drives everything. So despite the fact that they might be wrong, it's where they are from a perception standpoint of how things are that are going to drive legislators and politicians to make decisions one way or the other. So continue to invest in these things, continue to message the right way, continue to reach the right audience in the right way, in the right mediums. So thank you so much. You can find me on Cygnal's website, Twitter, Facebook, if I could be helpful to anyone. And thank you so much for the time today.
And Chris, thank you very much for your partnership in this poll. It's been really instructive, and I hope that everybody on the webinar today learned a lot. We'll be sending out the webinar. If you have more questions, like Chris said, contact him, contact us directly, and we'll try and get you the answer. So again, from CEN, thank you all very much.